Well, hello and welcome to More Bible, the official podcast of Reformation Covenant Church. In Jesus' high priestly prayer, he asked that his Father would sanctify his people by the truth, and then affirmed, "Your word is truth." So, in seeking to be a means of answering our Lord's Prayer, in each episode, pastors and church officers will take questions from church members and provide answers from the Bible so that our people can grow in a deeper, more faithful understanding and application of God's Word to their daily lives. I'm John Unger, Director of Administration and Discipleship at Reformation Covenant Church, and I'm here together again with Senior Pastor Bo Cogbill. Bo, we have had a couple of good conversations, and today I think what we would like to talk through is a question that came in this past week before the Super Bowl regarding how we ought to think about the Super Bowl, and not just the Super Bowl, but Sabbath day activities and what Christians should do, how we should obey the Sabbath, and what that looks like, and especially when we have a big event that happens on a Sunday that it seems like the whole world is thinking about and will be at least in some way attracted to and thinking about and involved in. And and I've thought about this for a long time. I'm excited to talk about it.
I'm sure you are. It's a very common question, especially in a new members class. We try to cover RCC distinctives, and the Lord's Day, Sabbath, is one of them. That's not uncommon in the history of the church, definitely not in Reformed churches, but it's increasingly more uncommon for it to be a practiced conviction, it seems, in churches. I know coming out of the North Texas Presbytery and the PCA, guys would note exceptions. So the Westminster Confession is a Sabbatarian confession that even forbids things like recreation on the Sabbath. And then, there's a discussion about that. But that was my first exposure to it. I don't know, I'd probably been in the church for 10 years before I had ever seriously considered really anything other than just go to church and have a good worship experience for that, hour and a half or 2 hours, and then basically do whatever you want the rest of the day. So I was very thankful to be discipled by a Lord's Day Sabbath guy. Was very helpful, beneficial to my family, to our rhythms, and encouraging us to think through Sunday. Really forced us to think through every other day as well, and then coming to realize that the fourth commandment is actually a 7-day commandment. That was kind of mind blowing as well. So, as someone who kind of likes to work, it was nice to be like, oh, God actually wants me to work for 6 days. That's nice. And this 7th day has been given as a gift. Initially, I understood it, it was a gift given to me. And then the more, I studied it, I always tell people, keep reading. Deuteronomy 5:12, observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates, so that your servants may rest as well as you. You must remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And so really seeing that from God's perspective, this is a gift given to us to give to others. So it's a love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself command. You've been given life. You've been given rest. Therefore, don't be like Pharaoh. Be like the Lord your God. And so it just over time began to be, I think, a command that we grew up into and really have always since then wrestled, well, how can we keep it better? Are there ways that maybe we're not setting apart the way that we should, and questions like Super Bowl and all that kind of stuff come up.
One of the things that strikes me about God's description of the Sabbath is, it's as you mentioned, it's 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, and the seventh day you shall rest, because this is what Yahweh did.
Right. That's the Exodus version.
Yeah, that's the Exodus version. And Deuteronomy, it's not just a creational covenant that God made. It's the redemptive covenant, right? Mm-hmm. Because God redeemed you. He brought you out of slavery. And so you are not to be slaves to your vocation, right? Mm-hmm. And imitate Yahweh in his rest. And it says in Exodus that not only did the Lord rest, but he was refreshed, right?
Which is weird because he's omnipotent.
Yeah, yeah. But the word there for refreshed, as I understand it, it has its roots in the idea of taking a breath, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the which is the same word as spirit, right? So, as we enter into the rest that God's called us to, we not just take a breath physically, but we enter into the rest of God through the Spirit, and into His rest that He has entered into Himself and has called us to enjoy with Him. So it's a personal. The Sabbath to me is very personal in that way. It's not just abstaining from labor, but it's entering into the presence and person of God. And that's, to your point, not just a 1 or 2 hour event on a given day. It's to be for the day, right? And the growing up in the Lutheran Church, I memorized the 10 words, and to your as you did, we just grew up going to church and then whatever you want afterward, right? You cut the grass, paint the house, right? Whatever it is, watch football.
Beat the Baptist to IHOP.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't even think twice about what the day itself meant, and the calling of God to actually rest and give rest, not just receive rest, but give rest. And I think that's a really important point that you make.
Well, that's the emphasis the larger catechism places on the fourth commandment is, why is this directed at superiors? And it's because God's preparing, in Deuteronomy, he's preparing them to go and take the land and be a blessing to the nations. And so he's preparing them to conquer the world. And as people in positions of authority that are representing God to the stranger and the sojourner, then one of the ways they reflect him to them is by not requiring them to behave like all the other slave owners, which is kind of some of what we talked about this last Sunday in Philemon. It was actually a way to bless the world, even if they weren't necessarily partaking in Passover and all of the festivals. The whole economy rested on the Lord's Day, and I think historically what you've seen is the more Christian a country or society is, the more likely they are to have Sabbath laws. The less Christian they become, those begin to fade. And the first people to suffer are the blue collar sort of slave class, if we can call them that are absolutely dependent on their hourly wage. And the white collar workers, they can check a couple of emails. It's not really that big of a deal on Sunday. Yeah. But all of your, restaurant workers, all of your people that are manual labor, they're the ones that don't get a day off. And that's on the people in positions of leadership, which is where the commandment's directed.
When I was a boy, everything was shut down. I grew up in Ohio. Yeah. And it wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that department stores, well, actually I started with the grocery stores, because when I was a kid, it was only the pharmacies. The pharmacies and the hospitals, worked. That was it. Mm-hmm. And then it became the grocery stores, and then it expanded to the department stores. And then, with all the advertising that had to support the football on Sunday and baseball and all the other sports on Sunday, everything was open at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And it became normative, right? And I think, to your point, the culture that we inherited from our forefathers had that Westminsterian ethos, right? Of no, this is a day set apart, and we not only receive rest, but we give rest, and that just completely fell away in the commercial idolatry, I would say, of our secular culture now, and I think the idea that that we rest is, I mentioned being refreshed. The rest itself is an act of faith, right? When you lay your head down at night and close your eyes, you don't know what's going to happen, right?
Right.
And I think even unbelievers sleep, and they have no idea what's going to happen when they sleep. And a lot of people are terrified of it, right? But I think, as Christians, it says in Psalm 127 that he gives his beloved sleep. And I think, as we apply that to our vocational endeavors, we rest on the Sabbath in faith. And God talks about that in Exodus, right? The Sabbath, he said, is a test, right? I'm going to test my people by giving you bread, manna, 6 days. And the seventh day, you're not going to have anything to go gather, right? And it's an act of faith that we say, okay, we're resting. We're not going to go out and gather. And if you gather something, it's going to breed worms. God's going to curse it. And I think we have forgotten that.
Well, for us, in some ways, we had to even redefine what work and rest meant, because when we first started trying to honor the Lord's Day, we defaulted to thinking about work and rest as activity and inactivity. And so there was a time where my conscience was agitated if we were exerting ourselves. And I mean, that's somewhat pharisaical.
Yeah.
That's the rub that Jesus ran into was he was actually being active on the Sabbath. He was, quote unquote, working on the Sabbath.
My Father has worked hitherto, and so have I. Right.
Right. And coming to understand that giving life on the Sabbath might require you to exert quite a bit of energy. So if you're going to open your home for hospitality, or make sure that your kids don't have to do their chores on that day and you go ahead and do a little bit of extra, or maybe you have to drive and go visit TRC because it would bless the saints over there. Those aren't violating Sabbath. Those are actually a way of being maybe even more active. I mean, even what I do on Sundays with preaching and teaching and a lot of counseling, and a lot of our elders are counseling. I think, 15 years ago, I would have been like, I don't know if we're pretty tired at the end of Sunday. Are we violating Sabbath? In actuality, I think we just had to rethink our categories a little bit.
You're actually obeying what
exactly
Jesus commands, right? And Jesus, in his rebuke of the Pharisees, says the priests profane the Sabbath and are blameless, right? Because that's their work, right? Is offering all the sacrifices and doing everything on the Sabbath, and Jesus says that's their duty.
That's what they're called to,
right?
Which is why it's weird when my pastor friends say that their Sabbath is on Tuesday. They're like, "Well, when do you do your Sabbath?" I'm like, Sunday. When do you do yours? I didn't know we got to move the thing. I don't do as much work on Mondays typically, but I don't know that we get to move the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Which is an assumption, that it moved from our perspective, Old Covenant to New Covenant. It did move to the Lord's Day, Sunday, with the resurrection of Christ and the practice of the early church. But it's not like, I don't think you can willy-nilly, you get to pick which day the Sabbath is.
Yeah. And the idea that of working, quote unquote, on the Sabbath, Jesus's disciples were picking grain, right? And I think I'm not sure who I heard this from, but one commentator mentioned that had the disciples been provided for, had Jesus been provided for, they wouldn't have had to go out and pick the grain, right? So there's an element of hospitality that goes along with the Sabbath. And to your point, extending hospitality does require work, right? And there may be people that have to work because we're not providing what we ought to be, for them or on their behalf. Or maybe we may be requiring them to do something that we ought not to.
Yeah, and to the point of I think one of the specific questions we got around the Super Bowl, you do eventually run into the question, because I remember I knew a Jewish guy that was a practicing Jew, and when I first started having questions about the Sabbath, he was like a senior project manager or something. I was like, hey, I know this isn't work related, but can I pick your brain about something? And so his name was Elliot Goodman. If that's not a Jewish name, I've never heard one. But we sit down and I'm like, I'm really wrestling through this Sabbath stuff. And he's like, stop right there. He's like, you don't want to have anything to do with it. And he described the way that they practice the Sabbath. They don't flush toilets. They don't, they turn the light sockets on before they go to bed on Friday nights so that they didn't have to, if they wanted to watch something on television, they put it to that channel the night before. And he just kind of started going through all of the different things that they did to ensure they weren't working. And understandably, he's like, you don't want to go down that road because the world that we live in right now is so automated. For you to try to even begin to practice this is impossible. And I think that's the question a lot of people have is, okay, well, now can I not watch TV on Sundays? Can I not turn on the lights on Sundays? Can I not flush the toilet on Sundays? Can I not drive my car on Sundays? Where does the
activity,
inactivity, or even causing someone to work, right? I mean, with the internet, do I get on the internet now on Sundays? The Super Bowl question. And I think from our conversations, it sounds like we think about it similarly, but maybe a little bit differently. The way I've always wrestled through it is direct causation and indirect causation. It seems to me, going into a restaurant, sure, the restaurant's already open. Sure, they're already going to have a waitress there and a dishwasher and a cook. But by my engaging that, I and my family and I are directly contributing to her having to work and them having to serve us. And therefore, that would be a more blatant violation of the Sabbath. Whereas participate or living in a world that is automated and already functioning, and everything we do has some tie to the Sabbath, seems to be an indirect cause, and therefore not as heinous, if at all, a violation of the Sabbath. Now, that said, we didn't even watch the Super Bowl this year, and I try to be strategic around it because I do wonder, well, if every Christian stopped watching it, that might cause them to move it. And so for me, it's like, how can I think strategically about it? But maybe the fact of the matter of it's a sin or not has been a way that I've maybe alleviated my conscience. I don't know, but you think about it a little differently, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that struck me a number of years ago about God's commands regarding the Sabbath, in Leviticus 23, he uses the word, you shall do no, the New King James uses the phrase customary work, and it's two words.
There's your problem right there.
The first word is related to servile work. And that's the word that is used in Genesis 2 and 3 regarding Adam's serving the ground. And so I believe that what God is referring to in that servile work or customary work, it's work tied to vocation. that we ought to be abstaining from work.
Your ordinary labors.
Your ordinary labors. And I think that goes to house projects, right? You've got, you got to, if the toilet breaks and you got a flood, I think that is, as Jesus would say, it's an ox in the ditch, right? Mm-hmm. You've got a dog or a cat or an animal that needs tending, right? Jesus says, "Who of you doesn't take your, lead your ox to or your donkey to water on the Sabbath day?" So I think those are normal things that you do, but your vocational tasks of dominion ought to be the ones. Those are the things that we ought to be careful to abstain from. And to your point about direct and indirect, thinking about the Super Bowl, you could make the argument using that logic to say, well, there's already going to be a Super Bowl. Am I really doing anything by watching it, by supporting the advertisers? So I think there's a number of things to think about. I don't know that I've resolved all of those. Mm-hmm. One of the things that has struck me about the Sabbath in the Scriptures and the way that the Sabbath has been approached in Nehemiah, the people of God are coming back from exile, and they got exiled from the land because of their disregard of Yahweh and His law and setting up idols. And one of the things that they did was break Sabbath. And so in the post-exilic covenant that Nehemiah makes with the people of God, one of the key components of that and commitments that they make is to keep the Sabbath day, because that's why they got kicked out, Nehemiah says. And so the people covenant to do so, and then Nehemiah records the fact that there were, it wasn't just Nehemiah telling the people, hey, this is what we have to do. There were merchants that were hanging around outside the gates waiting for the Sabbath to be over so that the people, could go out and on first thing on the first day of the week and go buy their wares. And Nehemiah chases them off and says, go away. He didn't even want the merchants outside the gates waiting for the gates to be opened on the first day of the week, and wanted the people of God to not be thinking about that. And as I understand it, he wanted a wholehearted commitment to Yahweh and His day on the Sabbath day, and not have any temptation, if you will, to indirect or direct causation of work. And he wanted the merchants to rest, right? He wanted to give rest to those people that were laboring to make money on the Sabbath, and he wanted them to work to rest as well. So, as we relate that to our day and the temptations and opportunities that we have to engage in commerce on the Sabbath and either indirectly or directly, cause someone to work, I think that those are passages we want to take to heart and really think through. We've tried not to go to the store on the Lord's Day, even if I'm low on gas, and it's self-serve gas, I'll try not to do that, right? Even though it's just me, in principle, I want to avoid those kinds of activities.
You mean full serve?
No, I'm talking about even self-serve, right?
Oh, yeah.
Pulling up to the pump and doing it myself, right?
You'd rather somebody else do it?
No, I'd rather not do it at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to avoid all of that.
Yeah,
right?
We try to get gas on Mondays and Saturdays. Yeah. Is typically what we do. Yeah, and I see the connection. If I were going to get gas on Sunday, like if we're driving home from being out of town or something, I would go to the self-serve, not the full serve, So, and I don't think I'm trying to strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. I think the heart of it is, I've received rest. I want to give it. And so the direct causation of work, if I can keep somebody from having to deal with one less customer that day, maybe I've tried to be somewhat of a blessing to my neighbor.
The Westminster Confession talks about works of necessity and mercy.
Right.
And I think that's an important distinction, as Jesus, shows us that healing on the Sabbath, bringing blessing, ministering
nurses,
grace,
doctors,
first responders, right? They are providing healing, helpful, blessed services to people, and I think that's those are important things. And you think about a hospital that's ministering to people on the Lord's Day, and their generator breaks down, right?
Right.
My son may be on call for his company, and he's got to go fix their generator, right? So those are, ox in ditches kind of thing. I also think about the story of the Good Samaritan, and the Good Samaritan picks up the guy that's on the road that's half dead, puts him on his own donkey, takes him to an inn, and he pays the innkeeper, says, take care of him while I'm gone, and when I come back, if I owe you anything, I'll take care of it. Well, presumably that innkeeper was going to have to work on Sunday taking care of that guy, right? And was getting paid for it, right? So I think there's nuances to this discussion in terms of ministry, mercy, hospitality that we want to take into consideration. So,
I had a pastor friend, and I don't know if we should have been joking about this, but we were joking about it back and forth. And he said, well, I want to be a blessing to the waitress who I know is dependent on, tips. So I'm going to go and bless her. And I said, do you really care about that waitress? He said, yeah. I was like, then I have some counsel for you. You should go into the restaurant and give every single waiter and waitress a $20 bill and turn around and leave. Talk about a blessing. You didn't exchange anything. You didn't force anything on her. If you really want to go bless her, just be a blessing. Don't have some reciprocity to it. And we laughed about it, but
probably would spend about as much money.
Yeah. So, I do think trying to reorient ourselves in a way that we're not thinking about what we can and can't do as the fundamental starting point, but what has God done? What has Christ done for you? What kind of rest has he given you in your soul, in your conscience, in your very being? And then what kind of gift is the Sabbath? And then how can you go and, extend that to other people, be a means of God's love in other people's life, I think is where we should begin wrestling or begin trying to have our thoughts centered. And that's the Hebrews argument, right? That Christ is our rest.
Yeah.
And there is still a rest to be pursued and given.
Yeah. And I think the what your point there about it's not what we can and can't do, it's what God calls us to do, what we ought to do for his sake and for the life of the world. And I think that's we often get caught up in that straining out gnats, right, and swallowing camels, in thinking about these things in a very narrow way, and it ends up being very selfish, right? What am I at liberty to do?
Right. What do I get out of the deal?
Yeah.
Which is literally the opposite of what you're supposed to be.
Yeah. What am I able to do to bless my brother?
Yes, exactly. And God is gracious enough to tell us what we can and can't do, because we're not smart enough sometimes to figure it out. And I think if we think of Israel's development and when Israel receives the law, he's a child, right? Out of Egypt, I've called my son. Well, Israel's a baby. And so Israel needs to be told, here's the law, here's the rules, here's what you need to do, here's what you can't do. Well, by the time you get to the true Israel, by the time you get to Christ, he knows what you can and can't do. He's applying the law with such wisdom that these guys that are supposed to be teachers of the law, they can't even begin to understand because they're not mature. They don't think about the Sabbath in the way that Jesus thinks about the Sabbath as a gift from God to be given to people. The Sabbath was made for man.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think as we are on this side of the cross, on this side of the resurrection, I think we have an example in Christ as to what the positive aspect of the Sabbath looks like. What does it look like to honor the Sabbath? I get to worship the Lord. I get to assemble with his saints. I get to, having received, grace and mercy, extend grace and mercy. And where better to look than the life of Jesus for that?
Yeah, and it seems, what we've talked about, some of this occurs to me that, we are in a exilic environment,
exactly.
Right? We're under judgment, right? I think it's fairly evident. And how do we get out of the mess we're in, right? And as it relates to the Sabbath, I think starting with your own family, right? Starting with your own brothers and sisters in your church and parish or community group, starting with your own relationships with the community. And
if you're a business owner, how do you run your employees? I mean, when I was at Austin, I was responsible for an entire department, and there were some pretty big projects all over the country that wanted us there Monday morning to do, training and leadership training for them. And I kind of put it out there that my team doesn't travel on Sundays. And my team was all Christians, actually. Well, they were all Christians. And that was met with a little bit of a resistance at first, but my team was so good at what they did, the resistance was gone immediately. They're like, well, fine, can you be out here on Tuesday? Well, sure, we'll see you on Tuesday. Or we'll fly in, we'll catch the earliest flight out Monday morning and we'll be there by lunch and we can do it at 2. And I think being the kind of people that were able to do that, I think it did eventually have a more widespread impact on other teams and on other ways that people were thinking about Mondays and Sundays and that kind of thing. So it's just one way to maybe try to do it.
And God blessed it, right?
He did. He really did. Yeah. I went from one person to, $4 or $5 million department in just a few years, which was kind of cool.
And you look at businesses like Chick-fil-A, Hobby Lobby, right? Yeah. They are still to this day not open on Sunday, and they are, multi-billion-dollar companies that are doing well and still committed to their keeping of the Lord's Day and blessing their employees with rest.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if we answered the Super Bowl question. It sounds like neither one of us watched it for different reasons. Not that I don't know that watching it's sinful necessarily, but it's just a way to think about it.
We were occupied with, we were enjoying hospitality that someone offered to us. So that was didn't even think about it.
Yeah,
it's good.
Yeah.
Watch some highlights.
I actually haven't. Part of it was the Mariners. I know that a lot of people if anybody's listening, they might like the Seahawks, but Seahawks and Patriots, it's not like I really even wanted to watch that thing anyway. If you want to test me, let's see if the Cowboys make it to the Super Bowl and then see how
they're all above the Mason-Dixon line, right?
See what my conscience is like on that Dallas Cowboys Super Bowl Sunday.
That's the test.
That's going to be the test.
Oh, good. Well, that's it for today. If you have questions about this or any other topic, please text either me or Pastor Cogbill, or you can email us at morebible@reformationcovenant.org. Again, that's morebible@reformationcovenant.org. Until next time, as the prophet Hosea exhorts us, let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. And remember to make the best use of the time God has given you for His glory and the life of the world. The Lord be with you all.
Amen.